the benefit of the podcast. The camera lady's having trouble. Black Holes, White Dwarfs by Sam Carter. Read by Elizabeth Bower. He'd booked them on a cruise to the Tannhauser Gate. First class, all-inclusive for their anniversary, even though he knew perfectly well that she'd have preferred the moon. She couldn't decide whether it was a romantic gesture or a selfishly practical one. Either way, he'd forestalled any objection by presenting the trip as a fait accompli, a gift. The ship, the Piccadilly, was elderly and smelled of the staleness of space. The discoloured titanium corridors creaked and cried alarmingly. The atmosphere on board had the permanent deodorant whiff of recycled air, and on the lower decks the fixtures were peeling and worn. "A lovely old girl," Theo had said approvingly, eyeing the ship's pitted hull as they'd watched it draw into the orbital dock. But the stateroom was smaller than their bathroom at home, and the carpet clung to their deck shoes and slippers with staticky ardour. Blue sparks glanced alarmingly from it at night when one of them got up to pee. You sure this thing'll get us to Orion?" she said quietly at dinner, when the artificial gravity blinked off for a second and everybody's food and cutlery and glasses suddenly rose, tumbling above the linen for a moment, before splashing and smacking back down. He'd given her a hard look and hadn't replied. It wasn't that she wasn't grateful, just that she'd expected it to be more, well, spectacular. The gate was famous, and everybody said you had to see the C-beams, even though no one knew what they were exactly. Whether they were living or dead or something in between, alien or machine, or both, or neither. You had to see them, though. The brochure described the C-beams as enigmatically majestic, or majestically enigmatic, Karen couldn't remember which. They swam the star-dusted depths around the cluster of white dwarfs off Orion's shoulders silently, endlessly glittering, huge and mysterious. She'd watched a programme about them on the in-ship documentary channel. They reminded her of those big old underwater animals from way back, whales or ichthya somethings. Some scientists thought that their constant shimmering and pulsing was a way of communicating through light, like whale song. Oh, so the voiceover said. The gate itself was a popular tourist attraction, but not because there was anything to see. In fact, quite the opposite. The twinned black holes, orbiting one another like courteous figurines on a Swiss clock, formed a portal to the Horsehead Nebula, a shortcut between galaxies. It had been discovered by accident. Nothing came out of the gate, only went in. The cargo liners were all automated because nothing living could withstand the jump, except the C-beams, if they were even alive. When there was a big shipment, you stood on the observation deck and stared at the cargo cruisers for ages, growing tinier and tinier, and then they were gone. It was quite boring to watch. And if you blinked at the wrong time, you could miss it completely. Theo filmed the whole thing, and even took a couple of pics and movies when the gate wasn't in use. The sightseeing group was up on the bridge, and the guide was explaining the whole system. Karen was annoyed at Theo's mindless tourist reflex to record absolutely everything, however unimpressive and dull. "It's a black hole," she said. "What's there to photograph?" Theo just sighed and kept snapping. In the onboard gift shop, you could buy plain black T-shirts with scrolling text at the bottom that said, "The Tannhauser Gate by night." You could also buy tiny coloured tees for kids. The styles were called White Dwarf and Red Dwarf. At dinner, the live band played old jazz standards badly, while Theo and Karen ate their food and swapped well-worn, semi-apocryphal holiday anecdotes with other couples. The limited skill of the ship chefs couldn't disguise the dry, salty tang of rehydrates. Karen wore a frock and jewellery for the first few nights. but seeing most of the other passengers slope up in sweatpants and sneakers, she swiftly decided not to bother. Theo seemed to find space stimulating. The gentler, cardiac-friendly gravity on board the ship gave him more energy and agility. His big frame was no longer so awkward to drag around, although his skull still scraped the bulkheads on the lower decks where they went on Saturdays to gamble and watch movies. He started to refer to the cruise as their second honeymoon, and when his thick, warm hands moved over her hips in the narrow 1.5-inch width bed, Karen didn't have the heart to halt them with her own. Instead, she turned over resignedly and did what they usually did when, with ever-decreasing frequency these days, they actually did it. That seemed to satisfy him. He didn't do the things that she liked in return, but it occurred to her that perhaps he'd forgotten, or indeed, never really known what she liked. Perhaps she hadn't been sufficiently grateful or enthusiastic when he first did them, and he'd become dispirited and confused. She didn't know. She wasn't sure it mattered. Here they were in far-flung space, on holiday, their second honeymoon. That was something, wasn't it? He fell asleep very quickly after sex, as though he were a canary and she put a cloth over his cage, or as if someone had switched off a light, although they always did it in the dark. She always imagined deep space as completely black, but the thickly sprinkled stars were laser white and shone intrusively through their single porthole if she didn't pull down the blind. Sometimes, when Theo was snoring and she couldn't sleep, she got up and stared through the inch-thick glass at the smooth ocean of darkness outside. She stared until her eyes blurred, and then she closed them to feel the starlight on her face, listening hard until she could hear the singing silence that pressed like a lover against the ship's hull. She imagined diving into the vortex of a black hole, through the airless frozen dark of space like a velvet rope pulled tight around the chest and eyes, and emerging into the pure, unarguable white of exploding light, the unsullied heart of a sun.